We don't talk enough about what presidents did before they were presidents, before the power, before the portraits, before anyone cared whether they could pronounce nuclear or navigate a peace treaty. We see them as these untouchable figures in history books, but they weren't always that way. They were surveyors, tailors, peanut farmers, failed haberdashers who couldn't sell a hat to save their lives. So, if you're ready, hit subscribe, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours uncovering the strange, verified, deeply human jobs that 45 people held before they ever stepped foot in the Oval Office, starting with a man who measured wilderness and rejected a crown. The surveyor who measured a nation. George Washington didn't start as a general. He didn't even start as particularly important. He started as a 16-year-old kid with a compass and a notebook, walking through the Virginia wilderness, drawing lines on maps that rich people would later argue about. Surveying. That was his first real job. Not glamorous, not heroic, just math and mud and mosquitoes. He was decent at it, apparently. Good enough that by the time he was 17, he was mapping out the Shenandoah Valley for Lord Fairfax, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. Imagine being 17 and your boss is a literal lord. The power dynamic alone would make you overthink every conversation. But Washington learned something valuable out there in the woods. How to read land, how to see value in empty space, how to imagine what could be built where nothing existed yet. Then he became a farmer, inherited Mount Vernon from his half-brother and turned it into one of the largest estates in Virginia, grew tobacco, then switched to wheat when tobacco prices tanked, which tells you he understood markets better than most modern cryptocurrency investors. He managed enslaved laborers, kept meticulous records, experimented with crop rotation, and generally ran the place like a man who believed systems mattered more than spontaneity. But the job that really defined him came later, commander of the Continental Army. Not because he was the best general available, but because he looked the part. Tall, dignified, didn't talk too much. Congress liked that. They gave him an impossible job, lead a bunch of farmers against the most powerful military on earth, and somehow, through luck and stubbornness and freezing winters, he didn't lose. He could have been king after that. People suggested it. He said no, which is either the greatest act of humility in American history or the smartest political move ever made. Maybe both. And that's where it all started, with a man who measured land, grew wheat, and rejected a crown because he'd already measured himself against history and decided he didn't need it. But not every founding father was so humble about power. Some of them defended the enemy in court just to prove a point. The lawyer who defended the Redcoats, John Adams, was a lawyer. A good one. The kind who believed in principles even when principles made him wildly unpopular, which is either admirable or exhausting depending on your tolerance for martyrdom. And in 1770, he made a decision that should have ended his career before it started. He agreed to defend the British soldiers who killed 5 colonists in the Boston Massacre. Yes, that Boston Massacre. The one where angry colonists threw snowballs and insults at nervous soldiers until someone fired a shot and chaos unfolded in the street. The one that became a propaganda goldmine for people like Samuel Adams, John's much cooler cousin, who turned it into a rallying cry for revolution. And John Adams, short, argumentative, deeply annoying John Adams, decided the soldiers deserved a fair trial. He won. Got 6 of them acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter, got their thumbs branded, and walked free. The crowd hated him for it. But Adams believed in the rule of law more than he believed in being liked, which honestly explains his entire personality. Before that, he'd been a school teacher. Hated it. Found children tedious and the pay insulting. So he became a lawyer instead, which is what you did in the 18th century if you were smart, argumentative, and bad at shutting up. He built a reputation, took cases no one else wanted, made enemies, made more enemies, eventually became a diplomat, which meant sailing to France and the Netherlands to beg for money and recognition while European aristocrats looked at him like he was a talking dog. He was also the first vice president, a job he described as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. He wasn't wrong, but it got him close enough to power that when Washington stepped down, Adams slid into the presidency like someone inheriting a restaurant and immediately changing the menu. He didn't reject a crown, he just never got offered one. But he laid the groundwork for the idea that law mattered more than popularity, which feels almost quaint now. And speaking of people who wrote things that outlasted them, the 33-year-old who wrote a breakup letter, Thomas Jefferson, was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. 33. The same age when most people are just figuring out health insurance and whether they should buy a home or keep renting. And Jefferson sat down in a rented room in Philadelphia and wrote the most famous breakup letter in human history. Dear King George, this isn't working out. It's not you. It's definitely you. We're leaving, signed, America. Before that, he was a lawyer, not a particularly passionate one. He found courtroom work tedious, which is fair because most legal work is tedious. He preferred reading, writing, designing buildings, collecting books, thinking about philosophy, and generally doing anything that didn't involve talking to clients. He was also a planter, which is a polite way of saying he owned a massive estate, Monticello, and the people who worked it. He served in the Virginia legislature, then became governor of Virginia, which he was famously bad at. When British troops invaded during the Revolutionary War, Jefferson fled. Just left. Rode away on horseback while the enemy looted the Capitol. His critics never let him forget it. But Jefferson had this ability to fail upward that's honestly inspiring if you don't think about it too hard. Then he became a diplomat to France, where he lived for 5 years, ate fancy cheeses, bought wine, collected art, and had a profoundly complicated relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who traveled with his daughter. History doesn't let you separate the genius from the moral catastrophe. Jefferson was both. Brilliant and monstrous. Visionary and hypocrite. He designed buildings, played violin, spoke 5 languages, kept detailed records of everything. Weather, expenses, crop yields, the exact day each vegetable appeared in the market. He was obsessed with systems, with knowledge, with control. And somehow, all of that made him the perfect person to write a document about freedom. Which brings us to someone who didn't write the Declaration, but did write most of the Constitution, which is arguably harder. The father of the Constitution, who weighed 100 pounds, James Madison, was small. Really small. 5 feet 4 inches, 100 pounds soaking wet. With a voice so quiet people had to lean in to hear him. He looked like a strong breeze could knock him over. And yet, this man, this tiny, soft-spoken, chronically anxious man, wrote most of the U.S. Constitution. Not all of it. He'd be the first to say that. It was a group project, but Madison showed up to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 with a plan. He'd read every book on government he could find, studied ancient democracies, analyzed why they failed, and he arrived in Philadelphia with a blueprint. Checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, the whole thing. He didn't just participate, he architected. Before that, he was a planner. Ran Montpelier, his family's estate in Virginia, which again means he was complicit in slavery even as he built a system theoretically based on equality. The contradictions are unbearable if you think about them for more than 10 seconds. He also served in the Virginia legislature, where he fought for religious freedom and generally annoyed people by being smarter than them. Then he became Secretary of State under Jefferson, which mostly involved writing strongly worded letters to foreign governments and trying to avoid war with Britain. Spoiler, he failed at that last part. Madison married late, 43, to Dolly Payne Todd, a widow 17 years younger than him, who became one of the most beloved first ladies in history while Madison remained one of the least charismatic presidents. She saved a portrait of George Washington when the British burned the White House. He wrote essays about constitutional theory. They were a very balanced couple. But before all that, Madison was just a sickly kid from Virginia who read too much and thought too hard. And somehow that was exactly what the country needed. Though not every founding father was an intellectual, some just knew how to survive. The last man in a cocked hat, James Monroe, was the last president to wear a cocked hat. You know, those three-cornered hats that look like something a pirate would wear if pirates cared about symmetry. By the time Monroe took office in 1817, everyone else had moved on to top hats and normal fashion. But Monroe kept wearing the old Revolutionary War style because he'd actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. He was 17 when he joined the Continental Army. 17. Dropped out of the College of William and Mary to go shoot at British soldiers, which is the 18th century equivalent of dropping out of college to join a startup. Except the startup was a country, and the product was independence, and the failure rate was astronomically high. He got shot at the Battle of Trenton. Musket ball to the shoulder, nearly died. Spent months recovering while Washington's army kept losing battles and losing hope. But Monroe survived, and that experience, getting shot for a cause that didn't exist yet, shaped everything that came after. He became a lawyer because that's what ambitious young men did. Served in the Virginia legislature, then became a diplomat, which meant sailing to France during the French Revolution, which was like being sent to a house fire to negotiate about furniture. He also served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War simultaneously under Madison, which feels illegal but apparently wasn't. Monroe wasn't flashy, wasn't brilliant, wasn't particularly charismatic, but he was steady, reliable, the kind of person you'd trust to finish what he started, even if it took longer than expected. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase while serving as minister to France, doubling the size of the country for $15 million, which in hindsight was the best real estate deal in history. And he kept wearing that cocked hat. A reminder that he'd been there at the beginning, that he'd bled for this. But not everyone who came after had fought in the Revolution. Some of them just inherited the consequences. The diplomat's son, who negotiated a war's end, John Quincy Adams, was 14 when he helped negotiate the end of the War of 1812. 14. Not as a child prodigy, though he was that, but as a secretary and translator for the American delegation in Ghent. He spoke French fluently because his father, John Adams, had dragged him across Europe during his childhood, treating him less like a son and more like a very short assistant. And that childhood never really ended. John Quincy spent his entire life in service to something. He was a diplomat to Russia, where he watched Napoleon's army freeze to death during the retreat from Moscow. He was a diplomat to the United Kingdom, where he navigated the same courts his father had once begged for money. He was Secretary of State under Monroe, where he crafted the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, or else. Before all that, he practiced law. Didn't love it, found it tedious. But it was what educated men did, so he did it. He also served as a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, where he pissed off his own party so thoroughly that they asked him to resign. He did. And then he kept going. After his presidency, widely considered a failure because he refused to play politics and just wanted to build roads, and fund science. He became a U.S. representative, the only president to serve in Congress after leaving the White House. He spent 17 years there, fighting against slavery, giving speeches so passionate he literally collapsed on the House floor and died 2 days later. But before all that, he was just a kid translating documents in a freezing room in Belgium, watching old men argue about borders while a war raged elsewhere. Learning that diplomacy was just exhaustion dressed up as negotiation. And speaking of exhausting people, let's talk about the man who fought 100 duels and somehow lived long enough to become president. The duelist who killed a man over an insult. Andrew Jackson killed a man in a duel. Actually killed him. Shot him in the chest over an insult about Jackson's wife, Rachel. The man, Charles Dickinson, had said something cruel, probably true, but cruel, about the circumstances of Rachel's first marriage. Jackson challenged him. They met at dawn. Dickinson fired first, hit Jackson in the chest, cracked a rib, lodged a bullet near his heart. Jackson stood there, bleeding, raised his pistol, and shot Dickinson dead. The bullet stayed in Jackson's chest for the rest of his life. He carried it around like a souvenir, like a reminder that he was willing to die to defend his wife's honor, and also willing to kill, which honestly tells you everything you need to know about Andrew Jackson. Before he was president, he was a lawyer, mostly a bad one. He took cases in Tennessee, argued with judges, got into fights, and generally behaved like someone who thought the law was a suggestion. He also served as a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court, which feels like putting a wolf in charge of a henhouse. But people respected his decisiveness, even if they didn't respect his temper. Then he became a general, won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, 2 weeks after the War of 1812 had officially ended, which didn't matter because news traveled slowly and Jackson became a national hero anyway. He also invaded Florida without permission, executed 2 British citizens, and dared President Monroe to do something about it. Monroe didn't. Jackson was a plantation owner, owned over 100 enslaved people, built his wealth on their labor while positioning himself as a man of the people, which is a contradiction so staggering it almost shorts out your brain if you think about it directly. But he was beloved, the first president who wasn't from Virginia or Massachusetts, the first who seemed rough, unpolished, dangerous. People loved that. They still do. And if Jackson was fire, the man who followed him was smoke, quiet, calculated, impossible to pin down. The little magician who built the machine. Martin Van Buren was called the little magician. Not because he did card tricks, but because he was short, clever, and seemed to make political problems disappear without anyone noticing how. He built the first real political machine in America, the Albany Regency in New York, and used it to control state politics so efficiently that people assumed he was cheating. He wasn't. He just understood that power came from organization, not charisma. Before he was president, Van Buren was a lawyer. A good one. He didn't have money or connections or a famous last name, so he learned to work the system. He joined every club, attended every meeting, remembered every favor, became indispensable. By the time he was 30, he was one of the most powerful men in New York, and most people couldn't explain how. He served as a U.S. Senator, as Attorney General of New York, as governor, though he resigned after 2 months to become Secretary of State under Jackson, which tells you where he thought the real power was. He was also vice president, a job he treated as a stepping stone rather than a retirement plan. Van Buren was meticulous, kept notes, wrote letters, built coalitions. He understood that politics was a long game, and he played it better than almost anyone. He also had impeccable fashion sense, wore fine suits, styled his hair carefully, and generally looked like someone who had never touched dirt in his life, which made it almost funny when he became president just in time for the Panic of 1837, an economic collapse so severe that people lost everything and blamed him for all of it. He hadn't caused it, but he was there, and that was enough. And speaking of bad timing, let's talk about the man who campaigned in a log cabin and died a month later. The general who gave the longest inaugural and the shortest presidency, William Henry Harrison, gave the longest inaugural address in American history, 8,444 words, 1 hour and 45 minutes, in the rain, without a coat, because he wanted to prove he was tough, vigorous, capable. He was 68 years old, the oldest president elected up to that point, and his opponents had mocked him as old and feeble. So he stood in the freezing rain and talked, and talked, and talked. 31 days later, he was dead. Pneumonia, probably, though some historians think it was typhoid from contaminated water in the White House, which is a deeply embarrassing way to go. Either way, he holds the record for shortest presidency, which is the kind of record nobody wants. Before that, he was a military officer, famous for the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where he fought Tecumseh's Confederation and won, sort of. It wasn't a decisive victory. It was barely a victory at all. But Harrison's campaign turned it into legend. Tippecanoe and Tyler too became the slogan. Log cabins and hard cider became the brand. It was the first truly modern political campaign, more about image than substance, more about vibes than policy. He also served as governor of the Indiana Territory for 12 years, where he negotiated treaties with Native American tribes, most of which involved taking their land and offering almost nothing in return. He wasn't uniquely cruel. He was just doing what the government wanted, which doesn't make it better. Harrison also served in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. He was a diplomat to Colombia for a brief period, and then he retired, ran for president twice, lost the first time, won the second, and died before he could do anything with it. The man who replaced him wasn't even supposed to be there. His Excellency John Tyler became president by accident. Literally. When William Henry Harrison died, nobody was sure what happened next. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the office, but did that make him president or just acting president? Tyler decided it made him president. Full stop. No acting. No asterisk. He took the oath of office, moved into the White House, and dared anyone to challenge him. They called him His Excellency. The name stuck. But Tyler didn't care. He'd spent his entire career being underestimated, and he knew how to leverage it. Before he was vice president, Tyler was a lawyer. Came from a wealthy Virginia family, studied under his father, and built a successful practice. He served in the Virginia legislature, then the U.S. House of Representatives, then as governor of Virginia, then as a U.S. senator. He was a strict constitutionalist, which meant he opposed almost everything the federal government tried to do. He believed in states' rights so fervently that he eventually sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, which is not a great legacy. But as president, Tyler was independent, vetoed bills from his own party, got kicked out of the Whig Party while in office, governed alone, without support, and somehow still managed to annex Texas, which set off a chain of events that led to the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery into the West. He married twice. His second wife, Julia Gardner, was 30 years younger than him and became First Lady at 24. They had 7 children together, which added to the 8 he already had, giving him 15 kids total. 15. The man was nothing if not prolific. And speaking of people who got things done, let's talk about the workaholic who expanded the country by half and then died from exhaustion. The workaholic who died from his to-do list. James K. Polk was president for 4 years. In that time, he expanded the United States by over 500,000 square miles, fought a war with Mexico, lowered tariffs, established an independent treasury, and literally worked himself to death. He died 3 months after leaving office at 53 from exhaustion and probably cholera. His final words were reportedly to his wife, "I love you, Sarah, for all eternity. I love you." And then he was gone. Before he was president, Polk was a lawyer in Tennessee. Wasn't flashy, wasn't particularly charismatic, but he was relentless. He served in the Tennessee legislature, then in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he became Speaker of the House, which is a job that requires either endless patience or a complete lack of self-preservation. Polk had both. He also served as governor of Tennessee, though he lost his re-election bid, which should have ended his political career. Instead, he became the first dark horse presidential candidate, someone nobody expected to win who won anyway because the other candidates couldn't stop fighting each other. Polk had a plan when he took office. 4 goals: lower tariffs, establish an independent treasury, settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, and acquire California. He accomplished all 4. Every single one. And then he left office and died, which feels like the most Polk thing possible. He wasn't popular. Didn't care about being popular. He cared about getting things done, and he did, even if it killed him, which it did. And speaking of people who didn't care about politics, let's talk about the general who never voted until he voted for himself. The general who never voted, Zachary Taylor, never voted in a presidential election until he voted for himself. He was 62 years old when he became president, and before that he'd spent 40 years in the army, moving from post to post, fighting wars, and generally avoiding anything resembling civilian life. He didn't think it was appropriate for a military officer to engage in politics, so he didn't. Not even once. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and then the Mexican-American War, where he became a national hero after winning the Battle of Buena Vista despite being outnumbered 4-1. People loved him, called him Old Rough and Ready because he dressed like a farmer and didn't care about military protocol. The Whig Party saw an opportunity. They didn't care what Taylor believed. They just knew he was popular. So they nominated him for president. He won. And then he had no idea what to do because he never thought about policy in his life. Taylor owned a plantation in Louisiana, owned more than 100 enslaved people. But as president, he opposed the extension of slavery into new territories, which confused everyone because it didn't align with his personal interests. He just thought the Union mattered more than the question, and he was willing to send troops to enforce that belief. He died 16 months into his presidency. Ate cherries and drank iced milk at a 4th of July celebration, got sick, and died 5 days later. Probably acute gastroenteritis. Some people think he was poisoned, but an exhumation in 1991 found no evidence of that. Just bad cherries and worse timing. And the man who replaced him, he wasn't supposed to be there either. But at least he could read. The self-taught president who founded a library. Millard Fillmore taught himself to read. Not because it was noble, but because he had no other choice. He grew up poor in upstate New York, worked as an indentured servant in a cloth mill, and had almost no formal education. But he found a dictionary, read it, memorized it, used it to teach himself law, which is either the most American story ever or the saddest, depending on how you feel about autodidacts. He became a lawyer, built a practice in Buffalo, served in the New York State Assembly, then in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he was competent but unremarkable. He became vice president under Zachary Taylor, which was supposed to be a quiet retirement job. And then Taylor died, and Fillmore became president. And suddenly, the guy who taught himself to read was in charge of a country tearing itself apart over slavery. He supported the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most morally indefensible laws in American history. It required Northerners to return escaped enslaved people to their captors, and Fillmore enforced it, sent federal troops to make sure it happened. He thought it would save the Union. It didn't. It just made everything worse. After his presidency, Fillmore helped found the Buffalo Historical Society, donated books, supported education, tried to build something that would last longer than his political career, which isn't hard because most people have forgotten he existed, but at least he tried, which is more than you can say for the next guy, who mostly just tried to avoid responsibility. The handsome failure who lost his son, Franklin Pierce, was handsome, strikingly so, tall, charismatic, with dark hair and a voice that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. He was also an alcoholic, a deeply ineffective president, and a man so consumed by grief that he could barely function. 2 months before his inauguration, Pierce and his family were in a train accident. His 11-year-old son, Benjamin, was killed in front of him, decapitated. Pierce saw it happen. His wife, Jane, never recovered. She spent most of Pierce's presidency in mourning, writing letters to their dead son. And Pierce, already prone to drinking, drowned himself in alcohol and regret. Before that, he was a lawyer in New Hampshire, served in the state legislature, then in the U.S. House of Representatives, then the Senate, where he was charming and well-liked, but didn't accomplish much. He also fought in the Mexican-American War as a brigadier general, though he fainted during a battle and injured his knee, which his opponents mocked him for relentlessly. As president, Pierce supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It led to violence, chaos, and the collapse of any hope for peaceful compromise. His own party refused to renominate him, which tells you how badly he failed. He drank. A lot. For the rest of his life. Died at 64 from cirrhosis of the liver, alone and mostly forgotten. History isn't kind to Pierce, and honestly, it shouldn't be. But at least he had friends. The next guy didn't even have that. The bachelor who died alone. James Buchanan was the only president who never married. He lived alone, died alone, and in between he presided over the collapse of the Union with all the effectiveness of a man trying to stop an avalanche by politely asking it to slow down. Before he was president, Buchanan was a lawyer in Pennsylvania, a successful one. He served in the state legislature, then in the U.S. House of Representatives for a decade, then as minister to Russia, where he negotiated trade agreements and attended balls and generally did the work of diplomacy without actually enjoying any of it. He was also a U.S. Senator, then Secretary of State under Polk, where he helped orchestrate the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of California, then Minister to the United Kingdom, where he was conveniently out of the country during the most divisive debates over slavery, which definitely helped his presidential campaign. Buchanan believed the Constitution protected slavery. He thought the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision was correct. He believed Southern states had legitimate grievances and that abolitionists were the real problem. He was wrong about all of it. And when Southern states started seceding, he did nothing, said they didn't have the right to secede, but also said he didn't have the right to stop them, which is the kind of logic that makes everyone want to scream into a pillow. He left office in 1861, lived for another 7 years, wrote a book defending his presidency. Nobody cared. He died at 77, the longest-lived president until Jimmy Carter, which is the only record he holds that anyone remembers, the rail splitter who taught himself law. Abraham Lincoln split rails, actual wooden fence rails, not as a hobby, not as a metaphor, but as a job. He was a teenager in Indiana, swinging an axe in the woods, turning trees into fence posts for farmers who paid him a few cents a day. It was brutal work, the kind that leaves your hands calloused and your back screaming. But Lincoln was tall, strong, and desperately poor, so he split rails. Thousands of them. Before he was a lawyer, before he was a politician, before he was anything resembling important, Lincoln ran a general store in New Salem, Illinois. It failed. Spectacularly. He and his partner went into debt so deep that it took Lincoln years to pay it off. People called it the national debt as a joke, which tells you how much faith they had in his business skills. He also wrestled competitively. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall, which in the 1830s made him a giant. He competed in matches across Illinois, and according to legend, he only lost 1 out of 300 bouts. That number is almost certainly exaggerated, but the point stands. Lincoln was strong, surprisingly quick, and very good at throwing people to the ground, which is a skill set that doesn't translate to politics, but probably should. He taught himself law, borrowed books, read them by firelight, memorized statutes, and passed the bar exam without ever attending law school. Then he became a successful trial lawyer, riding the circuit in Illinois, defending clients in small-town courtrooms, sleeping in shabby inns, and slowly building a reputation as someone who could argue a case and make people believe him. He served 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives, opposed the Mexican-American War, which was unpopular, so he didn't run for re-election. Then he went back to practicing law, thinking his political career was over. It wasn't. But it took a decade and a national crisis over slavery to pull him back in. Lincoln was awkward, told jokes that didn't always land, struggled with depression. But he had this ability to see the moral core of an issue and refused to let go of it, even when letting go would have been easier. That stubbornness saved the Union. It also got him killed. And the man who replaced him? He was the exact opposite in almost every way. The tailor who never went to school. Andrew Johnson never spent a single day in school. Not one. He grew up in North Carolina, bound as an apprentice to a tailor when he was 10 years old, and learned to sew clothes instead of learning to read. His wife, Eliza, taught him to write when he was 18. Before that, he was functionally illiterate, which makes his eventual rise to the U.S. Senate even more improbable. He was a tailor, a good one, opened his own shop in Greeneville, Tennessee, and built a successful business making suits for men who had more money and education than he did. But Johnson was ambitious. He joined debate clubs, learned to speak in public, and discovered he had a talent for it. He was loud, combative, and unafraid of a fight, which made him perfect for politics. He served in the Tennessee legislature, then as a congressman, then as governor of Tennessee, then as a U.S. senator, where he was the only Southern senator who refused to resign when his state seceded. He stayed loyal to the Union, which made him a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. Lincoln rewarded that loyalty by making him vice president in 1864. 41 days later, Lincoln was dead and Johnson was president, and almost immediately everything went wrong. Johnson opposed almost every measure to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He fought with Congress so aggressively that they impeached him, making him the first president ever impeached. He survived by 1 vote. Johnson was stubborn, self-righteous, and completely incapable of compromise. He believed he was defending the Constitution. He was actually defending white supremacy. History has not been kind to him, and it shouldn't be. But if Johnson was a disaster in peace, the man who came before him in war was a legend. Even if he had no idea what to do with the peacetime that followed. The general who failed at everything except war. Ulysses S. Grant was a failure. A spectacular, repeated, almost mathematically consistent failure at everything except killing Confederates. Before the Civil War, he tried farming. Failed. Tried selling firewood on street corners. Failed. Worked in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, and hated every second of it. He was 39 years old, broke, and working a job he despised for a father who barely respected him. Then the war started, and suddenly Grant was good at something. Really good. He understood how to move armies, how to press advantages, how to absorb losses and keep going when other generals would have retreated. He won battles, big ones, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and eventually he cornered Robert E. Lee at Appomattox and ended the war. Before all that, Grant went to West Point. Hated it. Graduated in the middle of his class. Fought in the Mexican-American War under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, where he learned that war was brutal, stupid, and occasionally necessary. Then he was stationed in California, far from his wife and children, and started drinking. A lot. His commanding officer asked him to resign. He did. Grant wasn't charismatic, wasn't eloquent, didn't look like a hero. He was short, quiet, and dressed like someone who'd given up on impressions. But during the war, he had something other generals didn't, a willingness to accept casualties if it meant winning. That sounds cold, and it was, but it also ended the war faster than any other strategy would have. As president, Grant was out of his depth. He trusted the wrong people, appointed corrupt officials, and presided over scandals that tarnished his reputation. But he also fought to protect the rights of Black Americans during Reconstruction, using federal troops to break the Ku Klux Klan. He tried. It wasn't enough, but he tried. And when his presidency ended, he went bankrupt again. Died of throat cancer while writing his memoirs to support his family. Even in death, Grant was fighting to survive. But the man who followed him didn't fight. He compromised. And in doing so, he ended the last hope for Reconstruction. The compromise that ended. Reconstruction, Rutherford B. Hayes became president through a deal. Not a vote, a deal. The election of 1876 was so close and so disputed that no one knew who won. Hayes lost the popular vote. The electoral vote was contested in 3 southern states, so Republican and Democratic leaders met in a back room and made an agreement. Hayes would become president, and in exchange, he would withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes agreed. And with that, the promise of equality for Black Americans in the South died. Jim Crow laws took over. Segregation became law. And Hayes, a man who'd fought for the Union as a Civil War general, became the president who abandoned the people he'd fought to free. Before politics, Hayes was a lawyer in Cincinnati, a successful one. He defended fugitive slaves in court, which was dangerous work in a city right on the border between free and slave states. Then the war started, and Hayes joined the Union Army. He was wounded 5 times. Once, he was shot in the arm during battle, refused to leave the field, and kept fighting until the battle was over. He was elected to Congress while still in uniform, which tells you how much people respected him. He served as governor of Ohio 3 times, built a reputation as honest, competent, and boring, which in the 1870s was a selling point because the Grant administration had been so corrupt that people were desperate for anyone who wouldn't steal. Hayes was a decent man. He banned alcohol in the White House, which his wife, Lucy, supported so strongly that people called her Lemonade Lucy. He supported civil service reform and tried to professionalize the federal government. But none of that matters as much as the fact that he traded Reconstruction for power. And if Hayes's presidency began with a compromise, the next man's presidency barely began at all before it ended in blood. The ambidextrous scholar who was shot. 4 months in, James A. Garfield could write with both hands, at the same time, in different languages, Greek with one hand, Latin with the other, simultaneously, just to prove he could. It's the kind of party trick that makes you either fascinating or insufferable, and Garfield was probably both. Before he was president, Garfield was a teacher, taught at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Ohio, which later became Hiram College. He taught Latin, Greek, mathematics, and eventually became the school's president at 26. Then he decided teaching wasn't ambitious enough, so he became a lawyer, then a state senator, then a congressman, then a Civil War general, and then a congressman again, which is a career path that suggests he had trouble sitting still. He served in the Union Army during the Civil War, rose to the rank of Major General, fought at Shiloh and Chickamauga, where he distinguished himself not by being brave, though he was, but by being smart. He understood logistics, supply lines, and how to keep an army functional, which mattered more than heroics. He served 18 years in Congress, became one of the most powerful men in the House of Representatives, and then, at the Republican National Convention in 1880, he gave a speech nominating someone else for president. The speech was so good that the delegates decided to nominate Garfield instead. He won the presidency without even trying. 4 months later, he was shot. A man named Charles Guiteau, angry about not getting a government job, walked up to Garfield at a train station and shot him twice. One bullet grazed his arm. The other lodged in his back. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for 79 days while doctors probed the wound with unwashed hands, trying to find the bullet and probably making everything worse. He died from infection, blood poisoning, and medical incompetence. And the man who replaced him had spent his entire career preparing to be underestimated, the gentleman boss who reformed the spoils system. Chester A. Arthur was corrupt, or at least, everyone assumed he was. He'd spent years as a political operator in New York, running the customs house, handing out jobs to loyal party members, and skimming money off the top like everyone else in the machine. He was the gentleman boss, polished, well-dressed, and deeply embedded in the patronage system that kept political machines running. Then Garfield was assassinated, and Arthur became president. And something strange happened. He changed. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe he just finally had the power to do what he thought was right instead of what his party demanded. Either way, Arthur supported civil service reform. He signed the Pendleton Act in 1883, which created a merit-based system for federal jobs and destroyed the spoils system that had made him powerful. His own party never forgave him. They refused to nominate him for a second term, and Arthur, who knew he was dying of kidney disease, didn't fight it. He left office, went home to New York, and died a year later at 57. Before politics consumed him, Arthur was a lawyer. A good one. He defended a black woman named Lizzie Jennings, who had been forcibly removed from a streetcar in New York. He won the case, and the city desegregated its public transportation. It was 1855. Arthur was 26, and for a brief moment, he was on the right side of history, before spending the next 20 years in the muck of machine politics. He dressed impeccably, owned 80 pairs of pants, redecorated the White House, and threw out wagon loads of old furniture, including a pair of Lincoln's pants, which horrified historians. But Arthur believed in appearances. And when he became president, he made sure the office looked dignified, even if he didn't think he deserved to be there. And speaking of dignity, the next man had so much of it that he hanged 2 people, and no one seemed to mind. The sheriff who hanged 2 men, Grover Cleveland, hanged 2 men. Personally, he was sheriff of Erie County, New York, and when 2 convicted murderers were sentenced to death, Cleveland pulled the lever himself because he believed if the state was going to execute someone, the person in charge should have the courage to do it. The first man was Patrick Morrissey, convicted of stabbing his mother to death. The second was John Gaffney, convicted of shooting a man during a card game. Cleveland stood on the scaffold, checked the ropes, and pulled the lever. Twice. Both men dropped. Both died. And Cleveland went back to work. Before he was sheriff, Cleveland was a lawyer in Buffalo. A competent one. Not flashy, not famous, but reliable. He worked hard, stayed honest, and built a reputation as someone who didn't cut corners. That reputation got him elected mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York, and then president, all within 3 years, which is the fastest political rise in American history outside of outright coups. Cleveland was the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. He won in 1884, lost in 1888 to Benjamin Harrison despite winning the popular vote, and then won again in 1892. He's counted as both the 22nd and 24th president, which is confusing but technically accurate. He was blunt, stubborn, refused to hand out political favors, which made him unpopular with his own party. He vetoed more bills than any previous president, including pensions for Civil War veterans he thought were fraudulent. People hated him for it. He didn't care. He also admitted to fathering a child out of wedlock during his first presidential campaign. His opponent's slogan was, "Mama, where's my pa?" After Cleveland won, his supporters responded, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." It was the 1880s. Politics were weird. And if Cleveland was blunt, the man who briefly interrupted his presidency was the opposite. Polished, respectable, and completely overshadowed by his grandfather. The grandson who lost the popular vote. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who died after a month. That's the most interesting thing about him, and he knew it. His entire campaign leaned on his grandfather's legacy, even though Harrison himself was a successful lawyer, a Civil War colonel, and a U.S. senator from Indiana. He won the presidency in 1888, despite losing the popular vote to Grover Cleveland by about 90,000 votes. The Electoral College put him in office, which made his presidency feel illegitimate to a lot of people. Harrison didn't help by being cold, formal, and completely devoid of charisma. People called him the human iceberg. He once shook hands with so many people at a reception that he started using both hands simultaneously just to speed up the process, which is efficient but deeply weird. Before politics, Harrison practiced law in Indianapolis, built a successful firm, defended railroads, corporations, and anyone else who could afford his fees. He also served in the Union Army during the Civil War, rose to the rank of brigadier general, fought at Peachtree Creek and in Sherman's Atlanta campaign. He was competent, solid, but never inspiring. As president, Harrison supported the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was supposed to break up monopolies but mostly just sat there looking official. He also supported the McKinley tariff, which raised taxes on imports so high that it contributed to an economic depression and cost him re-election. Cleveland came back in 1892 and crushed him. Harrison didn't even seem upset. He went back to Indianapolis, practiced law, and spent the rest of his life giving speeches about his grandfather, which feels like admitting defeat in the saddest way possible. But the man who followed Cleveland's second term, he didn't need a famous grandfather. He had a war, the major who rode a war to the White House. William McKinley rode the Spanish-American War to the presidency. Or rather, his allies did. McKinley didn't want the war. He tried to avoid it. But newspapers screamed for blood, the public demanded revenge after the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and McKinley, ever the politician, gave them what they wanted. The war lasted 4 months. America won, took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and McKinley, who had been a steady but unremarkable president, suddenly became the man who had expanded American power across 2 oceans. It didn't matter that he'd been reluctant. He got the credit. Before politics, McKinley was a lawyer in Canton, Ohio. Not a flashy one. He defended workers, small businesses, and coal miners, which made him popular with ordinary people. He also served in the Civil War, enlisting as a private and leaving as a major. Fought at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. Served on the staff of Rutherford B. Hayes, who became a mentor and lifelong friend. McKinley served in Congress for 14 years, then as governor of Ohio for 2 terms. He supported the gold standard, high tariffs, and policies that favored big business, which made him popular with industrialists and deeply unpopular with farmers and workers. He was calm, measured, always polite. And then in September 1901, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz walked up to him at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo and shot him twice. McKinley died 8 days later from gangrene. His last words were reportedly the lyrics to his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." And the man who replaced him, he was the exact opposite, loud, energetic, and completely, gloriously unhinged. The asthmatic kid who became a cowboy. Theodore Roosevelt was a sickly child. Asthma so severe he couldn't breathe without sitting upright. Weak, fragile. His father told him, "You have the mind, but not the body. You must make your body." So Roosevelt did. He lifted weights, boxed, rode, hiked, turned himself into someone who could barely sit still, let alone lie down and wheeze. Before he was president, Roosevelt was a rancher in the Dakota Badlands, moved there after his wife and mother died on the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884, and he couldn't stand to be in New York anymore. He bought a ranch, raised cattle, hunted grizzly bears, and wrote about the West like it was the last frontier of American manhood, which it kind of was. He was also a New York State assemblyman, the youngest ever elected at 23. Then he was police commissioner of New York City, where he walked the streets at midnight to catch cops sleeping on duty. Then assistant secretary of the Navy, where he spent most of his time preparing for a war with Spain that hadn't started yet. When the Spanish-American War finally happened, Roosevelt resigned his position, formed a volunteer cavalry regiment called the Rough Riders, and charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba. It wasn't even San Juan Hill. It was Kettle Hill, but no one cares because the story is better with San Juan. Roosevelt became a national hero, came home, got elected governor of New York, then vice president, which was supposed to be a quiet job where he couldn't cause trouble. Then McKinley was shot, and suddenly the youngest president in American history was a man who'd killed a cougar with a knife and once gave a 90-minute speech after being shot in the chest. He was 42, and he was just getting started. But not everyone who followed was so energetic. Some just wanted to eat. The judge who became Chief Justice, William Howard Taft, never wanted to be president. He wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That was the dream, the goal, the thing he talked about constantly. But his wife, Nellie, wanted him to be president, and Theodore Roosevelt wanted him to be president. And so Taft, ever the people pleaser, became president. He hated it every minute. He was a judge at heart, thoughtful, methodical, someone who liked clear rules and legal reasoning. Politics required glad-handing and compromise and smiling at people you despised. And Taft was terrible at all of it. Before the presidency, Taft was a lawyer in Cincinnati, then a judge, then Solicitor General of the United States, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, which he loved, then a federal judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which he loved even more. Then Theodore Roosevelt, freshly elected president, asked him to become governor of the Philippines, which had just been taken from Spain. Taft said yes, even though it meant leaving the bench, because Roosevelt was his friend, and you didn't say no to Theodore Roosevelt. He served as Secretary of War under Roosevelt, helped build the Panama Canal, mediated disputes, managed crises, And when Roosevelt decided not to run for a third term in 1908, he handpicked Taft as his successor. Taft won, then proceeded to disappoint Roosevelt so thoroughly that Roosevelt ran against him in 1912, split the Republican vote, and handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Taft left office and went back to teaching law at Yale. Then, in 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft finally got what he wanted. He served for 9 years, died in office, and reportedly said that his time on the court was the happiest of his life, which tells you everything you need to know about how much he hated being president. And the man who followed him, he loved being important. He just hated being questioned. The professor who refused to compromise. Woodrow Wilson was a professor, not just any professor, the president of Princeton University. He had a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins, making him the only president with a doctorate. He wrote books, gave lectures, believed deeply in the power of ideas and the importance of moral clarity. And when he became president, he brought all of that with him, for better and worse. Before Princeton, Wilson was a lawyer. Hated it. Practiced for exactly 1 year in Atlanta before deciding he'd rather study government than practice law. So he went to graduate school, got his PhD, and became an academic. Taught at Bryn Mawr. Then Wesleyan. Then Princeton, where he became president of the university in 1902. He reformed Princeton's curriculum. Tried to eliminate the eating clubs that divided students by class and wealth. Failed. The alumni hated him. The board forced him out. So Wilson, ever ambitious, ran for governor of New Jersey in 1910. Won. Spent 2 years fighting political machines and passing progressive reforms. Then ran for president in 1912. Won because Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote, and suddenly the professor was in charge. Wilson believed in his own righteousness in a way that made compromise almost impossible. He pushed through major reforms, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, antitrust laws, but he also resegregated the federal government, screened Birth of a Nation at the White House, and set back racial progress by decades. He led America into World War I, then tried to build a League of Nations to prevent future wars. The Senate rejected it. Wilson, stubborn to the end, refused to compromise. He went on a speaking tour to rally public support, suffered a massive stroke, and spent the last year and a half of his presidency as an invalid while his wife, Edith, effectively ran the country. And the man who followed? He was the opposite of righteous. He was just friendly. The publisher who loved poker, Warren G. Harding, owned a newspaper, the Marion Star in Marion, Ohio. Bought it when he was 22 with money borrowed from his father-in-law. Turned it into a successful small-town paper by printing local gossip, sports scores, and editorials that didn't offend anyone. Harding understood his audience. They wanted to feel informed without being challenged. Before journalism, Harding was a teacher. Hated it. Quit after 1 term. Then he tried selling insurance. Hated that too. The newspaper was the first thing that stuck, probably because it let him talk to people without having to actually help them. He served in the Ohio State Senate, then as lieutenant governor, then as a U.S. senator where he missed more votes than almost any other senator because he was too busy playing poker and drinking whiskey with his friends. He was charming, handsome, said things that sounded good without meaning much. When Republican leaders needed a candidate in 1920 who wouldn't scare anyone, they picked Harding. He won in a landslide, promised a return to normalcy after World War I and the Wilson years. People loved it. But Harding was in over his head. He appointed friends to positions they weren't qualified for. His administration was riddled with scandals. Teapot Dome, the Veterans Bureau, the Department of Justice, Harding knew something was wrong. He once said, "I have no trouble with my enemies. It's my friends that keep me walking the floor at night." He died in office in August 1923. Heart attack, probably. Some people think his wife poisoned him, but there's no evidence. Just gossip, which, fittingly, is exactly the kind of thing his newspaper would have printed. And the man who replaced him barely said a word. Silent Cal Calvin Coolidge was called Silent Cal because he almost never spoke. At a dinner party, a woman sitting next to him said, "Mr. Coolidge, I've made a bet that I can get you to say more than 2 words." Coolidge replied, "You lose." That was it. That was his entire personality. Before he was president, Coolidge was a lawyer in Northampton, Massachusetts. Small town work, wills, contracts, property disputes. He joined the local Republican Party, started attending meetings, and slowly climbed the ladder. City councilman, city solicitor, state representative, mayor, state senator, lieutenant governor, governor. As governor, Coolidge became nationally famous for breaking the Boston police strike in 1919. The police walked off the job demanding better pay and working conditions. Riots broke out. Coolidge called in the state guard, fired the striking officers, and declared, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." It was harsh. It worked. And it made him a hero to people who feared unions and disorder. He became vice president under Harding. Then Harding died, and Coolidge, visiting his father in Vermont, was sworn in by his father, a notary public, at 2:47 a.m. by the light of a kerosene lamp. It's the most New England thing that's ever happened. Coolidge believed in small government, low taxes, and leaving people alone. He slept 11 hours a day, took naps, rarely held press conferences, and when he did speak, it was in short, dry sentences that somehow made people trust him. He left office in 1929, could have run again, chose not to, went home to Northampton, wrote his autobiography, died 4 years later. His last words were reportedly, "Good morning, Robert," to a carpenter working in his house. Even in death, Coolidge kept it brief. And the man who followed? He tried to fix everything. And failed spectacularly. The engineer who fed Europe. Herbert Hoover wasn't a politician. He was an engineer. A Stanford-trained mining engineer who spent his early career traveling the world, China, Australia, Burma, finding mineral deposits and making companies rich. He was good at it, made a fortune, retired at 40. Then World War I started, and Hoover found a new job. Feeding people. He organized relief efforts in Belgium, distributing food to millions of civilians trapped behind German lines. Then, after the war, he led efforts to feed war-torn Europe, preventing mass starvation across the continent. He saved millions of lives, literally millions. And he did it through logistics, organization, and sheer competence. He served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, expanded the role into something that actually mattered, promoted standardization, efficiency, trade expansion. When Coolidge chose not to run in 1928, Hoover ran and won easily. People saw him as a problem solver, a man who got things done. Then 7 months into his presidency, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began, and Hoover, for all his competence, had no idea how to fix it. He believed in limited government, voluntary cooperation, and the idea that the economy would correct itself. It didn't. Unemployment hit 25%. Banks failed. People starved. And Hoover, the man who'd fed Europe, couldn't figure out how to feed America. He tried. Public works projects, tax cuts, loans to businesses, but it wasn't enough. And when veterans marched on Washington demanding early payment of their bonuses, Hoover sent in the army to disperse them with tear gas and bayonets. The images destroyed what little remained of his reputation. He lost to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 in one of the biggest landslides in history, spent the rest of his life writing, giving speeches, and trying to rebuild his legacy. He lived to 90, long enough to see history soften slightly, but not enough to erase the Depression. The paralyzed aristocrat who refused to quit Franklin Delano Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down. Polio hit him in 1921 when he was 39 years old, a rising political star with a famous last name and unlimited ambition. One day, he was swimming at his family's summer home on Campobello Island. The next, his legs stopped working. Just stopped. The pain was excruciating. The diagnosis was devastating. And Roosevelt, who'd spent his entire life assuming the world would bend to his will because that's what happened when you were born rich and named Roosevelt, suddenly had to figure out how to live in a body that wouldn't cooperate. He never walked again. Not really. He could stand with leg braces locked at the knee and someone holding his arm, but it was a performance, not mobility. Every public appearance required careful staging. Every photograph was controlled. The press cooperated, rarely showing him in his wheelchair, because that's how things worked back then. Image mattered. Weakness wasn't acceptable, so Roosevelt hid his paralysis in plain sight and dared anyone to mention it. Before polio got to Bowman, Roosevelt's life had been absurdly privileged. Born at Hyde Park, the family estate in New York, educated at Groton and Harvard, married to his distant cousin Eleanor, herself a Roosevelt, and launched into politics on name recognition alone. He served in the New York State Senate, where he fought Tammany Hall and made enemies immediately. Then he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, the same position Theodore Roosevelt had held before charging up San Juan Hill. Franklin desperately wanted to be like his cousin Theodore, wanted the glory, the action, the larger-than-life legacy. He ran for vice president in 1920 on the Democratic ticket with James Cox. They lost badly. Harding won in a landslide, and Roosevelt went back to New York to practice law and plan his next move. Then polio happened, and for a while it seemed like his political career was over. But Roosevelt didn't quit. He spent years at Warm Springs, Georgia, swimming in the therapeutic pools, rebuilding his upper body strength, and convincing himself and everyone else that he could still lead. In 1928, he ran for governor of New York and won. Served 2 terms, built a national profile. And in 1932, when the country was collapsing under the weight of the Great Depression, Roosevelt ran for president promising a New Deal for the American people. He won. Took office in March 1933, with the economy in ruins, banks failing, unemployment at 25%, and a population that had lost faith in everything. His first 100 days in office were a blur of legislation, banking reform, relief programs, public works projects. Some of it worked, some didn't. But Roosevelt projected confidence, spoke directly to people through radio fireside chats, and made them believe the government actually cared. He was re-elected 3 more times, the only president to serve more than 2 terms. Led the country through the Depression and World War II. Died in office in April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered. And when he died, people wept. Not because he'd been perfect, he wasn't, but because he'd refused to let paralysis or economic collapse or global war stop him from trying. And the man who replaced him? He'd failed at almost everything before politics saved him. The haberdasher who dropped the bomb. Harry S. Truman owned a hat store, a haberdashery in Kansas City, Missouri, selling men's hats and ties and shirts to customers who mostly didn't have money to spend. He opened it in 1919 with a partner named Eddie Jacobson, a friend from the Army. For 3 years, they tried to make it work. Then the post-war economy collapsed. Customers stopped buying hats, and the store went bankrupt. Truman spent the next 15 years paying off the debt, every cent. He refused to declare bankruptcy because he thought it was dishonorable, which tells you almost everything about Harry Truman. Before the hat store, Truman was a farmer. Grew up in Independence, Missouri. Worked his family's farm for over a decade, plowing fields and feeding livestock and doing the kind of back-breaking labor that doesn't show up in presidential biographies but shapes a person nonetheless. He had terrible eyesight, thick glasses. Couldn't join the military when World War I started because of it, but he memorized the eye chart, passed the exam, and became an artillery captain in France, led his unit through combat, didn't lose a single man, came home a hero, and opened a hat store. After the store failed, Truman got into politics, became a county judge in Jackson County, Missouri. Not a legal judge, but an administrative position overseeing roads and infrastructure. He was competent, honest, got things done. And in 1934, he ran for the U.S. Senate with the backing of Tom Pendergast's political machine in Kansas City. Pendergast was corrupt. Everyone knew it. But Truman wasn't, and he won anyway. He served in the Senate for 10 years. Investigated waste in military spending during World War II, saving the government billions of dollars. Built a reputation as a straight shooter. Then Franklin Roosevelt, running for his fourth term in 1944, needed a new vice president. He picked Truman. They barely knew each other. Roosevelt died 82 days later, and Truman became president. He had no idea what he was walking into. Roosevelt had kept him out of major decisions. Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb until after he was sworn in. Then he had to decide whether to use it. He did, twice. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. Hundreds of thousands died instantly, and millions more were spared a land invasion of Japan. Truman carried that decision for the rest of his life. He won re-election in 1948 in the biggest upset in American political history. Every poll said he'd lose. The Chicago Tribune printed "Dewey defeats Truman." Before the votes were counted, Truman won anyway. Held up the newspaper and grinned. He left office unpopular. The Korean War dragged on. His approval rating tanked, but history softened on him. People remembered the tough farm kid who paid his debts and made impossible decisions without flinching. And the man who followed him? He'd spent his entire life preparing for war. Peace confused him. The general who warned about the military, David Eisenhower, never wanted to fight in World War I. He wanted to, desperately. But the Army assigned him to train tank crews at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and by the time he was ready to ship overseas, the war ended. He spent the 1920s frustrated, stuck in peacetime assignments, convinced his career would amount to nothing. Then World War II started, and suddenly Eisenhower's talent for organization mattered more than his ability to shoot. He understood logistics, supply lines, how to coordinate massive operations across continents. George Marshall noticed, promoted him, put him in charge of planning the invasion of North Africa, then Sicily, then D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Eisenhower wasn't the best battlefield tactician, wasn't the most creative strategist, but he could manage egos, coordinate allies, and keep an impossibly complex operation from falling apart. That was enough. Before the war, Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915. Middle of his class. Served under some of the best generals in the Army, including Douglas MacArthur, who thought Eisenhower was brilliant but unambitious. Ike spent years in staff positions, writing reports, planning exercises, doing the unglamorous work that doesn't get you medals but teaches you how organizations function. After the war, he became Army Chief of Staff, then president of Columbia University, a job he was terrible at because he didn't understand academics and they didn't understand him. Then NATO's first supreme commander, organizing the defense of Western Europe against the Soviet threat. In 1952, both parties wanted him to run for president. Eisenhower was a Republican, but barely. He'd never voted, didn't care much about domestic policy, but he believed in duty, and when the party came calling, he ran. Won easily. Served 2 terms. As president, Eisenhower built the interstate highway system, sent federal troops to enforce desegregation in Little Rock, and quietly avoided wars while building up America's nuclear arsenal. He was cautious, methodical, boring even. But in his farewell address in January 1961, he warned about the military-industrial complex, the growing power of defense contractors, and military spending. It was a strange warning from a career soldier, but Eisenhower had seen what war did. He knew the cost, and he didn't want future presidents to forget it. The man who replaced him had seen war too, but he was young, charismatic, and convinced he could manage anything. The PT boat commander who wrote a book about courage, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was in the Pacific when a Japanese destroyer rammed his patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, in the middle of the night. The boat split in half, sank. 2 crew members died instantly. Kennedy and the 10 survivors clung to wreckage in the dark, surrounded by ocean and enemy ships, waiting to die or be rescued, whichever came first. Kennedy didn't wait. He swam. Towed an injured crew member 3 miles to a nearby island, gripping the man's life jacket strap in his teeth while swimming through shark-infested waters. They survived on coconuts. Kennedy carved a message into a coconut shell and gave it to local islanders, who paddled it to Allied forces. 6 days later, they were rescued. The coconut sat on Kennedy's desk in the Oval Office, a reminder. Or maybe just a good story. With Kennedy, it was hard to tell the difference. Before the war, Kennedy was a rich kid, born into one of the wealthiest families in America. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a ruthless businessman and former ambassador to the United Kingdom who expected his sons to achieve greatness or die trying. Joe Jr., the oldest, was supposed to be president, but Joe died in the war when his bomber exploded over the English Channel. So the family's ambitions shifted to Jack. Kennedy went to Harvard, wrote his senior thesis on why Britain wasn't ready for World War II, published it as a book, Why England Slept, which became a bestseller, though everyone suspected his father's money and connections helped. After the war, Kennedy worked briefly as a journalist, covering the founding of the United Nations and elections in Europe. Then he ran for Congress in Massachusetts, won easily, served 3 terms in the House, then moved to the Senate in 1952. He married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953 and wrote another book, Profiles in Courage, about senators who'd taken unpopular stands. Won the Pulitzer Prize for it, though rumors persist that his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, wrote most of it. Kennedy denied it. Sorensen stayed quiet. Kennedy ran for president in 1960. Young, Catholic, handsome, and completely untested in executive leadership. He debated Richard Nixon on television, the first televised presidential debates, and looked calm, tanned, and confident, while Nixon sweated under the lights. Kennedy won by the narrowest margin in history. Some said Chicago Mayor Richard Daley stole Illinois for him. Kennedy didn't care. He was president. He governed for 1,036 days, not even 3 years, faced the Bay of Pigs disaster, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the early escalation in Vietnam. Then, on November 22nd, 1963, he was shot in Dallas, dead at 46, the youngest elected president, the youngest to die in office. and the most mythologized because grief and what ifs are powerful storytellers. And the man who replaced him, he was the opposite: tall, crude, and brutally effective at getting what he wanted. The teacher who became the master of the Senate. Lyndon Baines Johnson taught school in Cotulla, Texas in 1928, 20 years old. Fresh out of college, assigned to teach poor Mexican-American kids in a tiny, underfunded school where most students didn't speak English and nobody expected them to amount to anything, Johnson taught them anyway, pushed them, made them believe they mattered. Years later, when he signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he said he thought about those kids, how the system had failed them, how it failed everyone who wasn't white and wealthy. Before teaching, Johnson grew up poor in the Texas Hill Country. His father was a failed politician and failed businessman who lost everything. Johnson swore he'd never be poor again, never be powerless. He worked his way through the Southwest Texas State Teachers College, graduated, taught for a year, then got a job as a congressional secretary in Washington. He was 23, arrived in D.C. with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work longer and harder than anyone else. He learned how Congress worked, who had power, who wanted it, how to trade favors, how to make people owe you. In 1937, he ran for Congress from Texas's 10th district and won. Became the youngest congressman in the country. Spent 4 terms in the House, then ran for Senate in 1948 in one of the closest, dirtiest elections in Texas history. He won by 87 votes. His opponents claimed fraud, probably correctly, but Johnson won, and that's what mattered. He became the most effective Senate Majority Leader in American history. Knew every senator's weaknesses, ambitions, and pressure points. Could cajole, threaten, charm, and bully votes out of people who swore they'd never support his bills. He passed legislation everyone said was impossible. Then Kennedy picked him as vice president in 1960, and Johnson, who'd spent his life accumulating power, suddenly had almost none. He hated being vice president, felt useless. Then Kennedy was killed, and Johnson was president, and suddenly he had all the power he'd ever wanted at the worst possible moment. He passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Medicare, Medicaid, the War on Poverty, transformed American society in ways that are still felt today. But he also escalated the Vietnam War, sent hundreds of thousands of troops, lied about progress, watched the war consume his presidency and his legacy. In March 1968, he announced he wouldn't run for re-election, left office broken, died 4 years later at 64. And the man who followed him had spent his entire career being underestimated, despised, and somehow still winning. Tricky Dick Richard Nixon was called Tricky Dick. The name stuck because it fit. He was awkward, paranoid, resentful, and so obsessed with his enemies, real and imagined, that he bugged his own office and recorded every conversation, which eventually destroyed him. Before politics consumed him, Nixon was a lawyer. Practiced in Whittier, California, his hometown. Took whatever cases came through the door. Then World War II started, and Nixon joined the Navy. Served in the Pacific as a supply officer. Never saw combat. Spent most of the war playing poker, which he was very good at. Came home with money and a plan. He ran for Congress in 1946. Ran a brutal campaign against his Democratic opponent, accusing him of being soft on communism. It worked. Nixon won. Served 2 terms in the House, where he became famous for prosecuting Alger Hiss, a State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy. Hiss denied it. Nixon didn't believe him. Pushed the investigation. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury. Nixon became a national figure. He ran for Senate in 1950, 1. Served 2 years before Eisenhower picked him as vice president in 1952. Nixon was 39, young, ambitious, and willing to do the dirty work Eisenhower wouldn't. He attacked Democrats, traveled the world, debated Khrushchev in a model kitchen in Moscow, defending American capitalism like it was a religion. He ran for president in 1960, lost to Kennedy by the thinnest margin in history, blamed the media, blamed vote fraud in Chicago, then ran for governor of California in 1962. Lost again. Held a press conference and told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Everyone thought he was done. He wasn't. He spent 6 years rebuilding. Traveled, gave speeches, positioned himself as the only Republican who could win in 1968. And he did. Barely. Won the presidency in one of the closest elections in history, promising to end the Vietnam War and restore law and order. He expanded the war into Cambodia, opened relations with China, created the EPA, signed Title IX, won re-election in 1972 in a landslide. Then Watergate happened, the cover-up, the tapes, the impeachment hearings, and in August 1974, Nixon resigned. The only president to ever do so. He spent the rest of his life trying to rehabilitate his image, wrote books, gave interviews, advised presidents, died in 1994, and even in death, people still called him Tricky Dick. The man who replaced him never wanted the job. He just wanted to play football. The congressman who became president by accident, Gerald Ford, played football at the University of Michigan, center and linebacker. Good enough that the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions both offered him contracts. He turned them down to go to Yale Law School, which is either smart or insane depending on how you feel about professional football versus constitutional law. Before law school, Ford grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His birth name was Leslie Lynch King Jr., but his mother left his abusive father when Ford was 2, remarried a paint salesman named Gerald Ford, and changed her son's name. Ford didn't find out until he was 17. His biological father showed up one day, took him to lunch, and left. They never spoke again. Ford served in the Navy during World War II. Spent most of the war on the USS Monroe, an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Nearly died when a typhoon hit and the ship rolled so violently that planes broke loose and started fires. Ford helped fight the fires, survived. Came home, got married, became a lawyer. He ran for Congress in 1948 from Michigan's 5th District. Won. Served 25 years in the House, eventually becoming Minority Leader, the longest serving one in history. He was well-liked, steady, not brilliant, but competent and decent, which in politics is rarer than brilliance. In 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned after being caught taking bribes. Nixon needed a replacement, picked Ford. 8 months later, Nixon resigned and Ford became president. He'd never been elected to national office, never even run. And suddenly, he was in charge. His first major act as president was pardoning Nixon. It was deeply unpopular. People wanted accountability. Ford thought the country needed to move on. He was probably right, but it cost him politically. He lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976 and went back to Michigan. He lived to 93, longer than any other president until both Carters outlived him. And he spent those years playing golf, giving speeches, and insisting that pardoning Nixon was the right thing to do. And the man who followed him? He was a nuclear submarine officer who came home to grow peanuts. The submariner who became a peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter, served on nuclear submarines. Not just served. He was an officer trained by Admiral Hyman Rickover, the man who built America's nuclear navy. Rickover was brilliant, demanding, and cruel. He interviewed Carter for hours, asking impossible questions, watching him squirm. Finally, he asked, "Did you always do your best at the Naval Academy?" Carter, proud, said, "No, sir, I didn't always do my best." Rickover stared at him and asked, "Why not?" Carter had no answer. The interview ended. He got the job anyway. Carter was being groomed for greatness in the Navy. He could have stayed, made admiral, spent his career in uniform. Then his father died in 1953, and Carter resigned his commission to go home to Plains, Georgia, and take over the family peanut farm and warehouse. His wife, Rosalind, was furious. She loved the Navy, loved travel, didn't want to move back to a tiny town in rural Georgia. But Carter went anyway. He ran the farm, joined the local school board, served in the Georgia State Senate, then ran for governor in 1970 and won, served one term, built a reputation as a reformer, integrated state agencies, appointed black officials, declared that the time for racial discrimination is over, which in 1971 Georgia was either brave or politically suicidal, depending on who you asked. In 1976, Carter ran for president. Nobody outside Georgia knew who he was, but he campaigned relentlessly, promised honesty after Watergate, won the Democratic primary, picked Walter Mondale as his running mate, barely beat Ford. Carter's presidency was a disaster. The economy tanked. Inflation soared. The Iran hostage crisis dragged on for 444 days. Americans were held captive in Tehran, and Carter couldn't get them out. A rescue mission failed catastrophically. Helicopters crashed in the desert. 8 servicemen died. The mission was aborted. Carter did pass major legislation, Camp David Accords, Panama Canal treaties, energy policy, created the Department of Education, but none of it mattered because people felt like the country was falling apart, and Carter seemed powerless to stop it. He lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980 in a landslide, went home to Plains, and then did something no other ex-president had done. He became more beloved after leaving office than during it. Built houses with Habitat for Humanity, monitored elections, wrote books, won the Nobel Peace Prize, lived to 99, outlived everyone. And the man who beat him? He'd saved 77 people from drowning before he ever stepped in front of a camera. The lifeguard who became the Gipper, Ronald Reagan, saved 77 people from drowning. Worked as a lifeguard at Lowell Park in Dixon, Illinois, every summer from 1926 to 1932. 77 rescues. He kept a notch in a log for every person he pulled from the Rock River. Some of them didn't even thank him. Just walked away, dripping and annoyed, like getting saved was an inconvenience. Before Hollywood, Reagan was a radio announcer, called Chicago Cubs games for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. He'd sit in a studio, read telegraph updates of the game, and make up the play-by-play. Imagined the crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd. He was good at it. Good at making people believe in something that wasn't there. Then he went to California in 1937 to cover spring training, took a screen test, and got a contract with Warner Brothers, made 53 films over 20 years, mostly B-movies, westerns, comedies. He played the hero, the good guy, the one you could trust. He wasn't a great actor, but he was likable, which turned out to be more important. He became president of the Screen Actors Guild, testified before Congress about communism in Hollywood, named names, worked as an FBI informant, reporting on colleagues he suspected of being sympathetic to the Communist Party. Then he became a spokesman for General Electric, touring factories, giving speeches about free enterprise and the dangers of big government. That's where he refined his political philosophy, or discovered he had one. He ran for governor of California in 1966. 1. Served 2 terms. Cracked down on student protests at UC Berkeley, cut funding for mental health services, built a conservative base, then ran for president in 1976, lost the Republican primary to Ford, and ran again in 1980. Won in a landslide. Reagan was shot 2 months into his presidency. John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 times outside the Washington Hilton. 1 bullet hit Reagan in the chest, missed his heart by an inch, and collapsed his lung. Reagan walked into the hospital, then collapsed. Nearly died. Recovered. Joked with doctors, "I hope you are all Republicans." He was 70, the oldest president ever elected, and he'd just survived an assassination attempt like it was an inconvenience. He served 2 terms, cut taxes, increased military spending, funded anti-communist rebels around the world, negotiated with Gorbachev, watched the Berlin Wall fall, left office beloved even though his policies created deficits, gutted social programs, and ignored the AIDS crisis. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1994, wrote a letter to the American people saying goodbye, died 10 years later, and the man who replaced him had been preparing for the presidency his entire life. The youngest Navy pilot, who became CIA Director George Herbert Walker Bush, was shot down over the Pacific Ocean in September 1944. He was a Navy pilot flying a torpedo bomber on a mission to attack a Japanese radio station on Chichijima. Anti-aircraft fire hit his plane. The engine caught fire. Bush stayed in the cockpit long enough to drop his bombs, then bailed out. His 2 crew members died. Bush parachuted into the ocean, inflated his life raft, and paddled for 4 hours while Japanese boats tried to capture him. An American submarine surfaced, pulled him aboard, and saved his life. He was 20 years old. Before the war, Bush grew up wealthy. His father, Prescott Bush, was a senator from Connecticut and a partner at a major investment bank. George went to Phillips Academy, enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday, and became the youngest pilot in the Navy at the time. After the war, he went to Yale, played first base on the baseball team, graduated, then moved to Texas to work in the oil industry instead of taking a comfortable job on Wall Street. He co-founded Zapata Petroleum, drilled for oil, made money, moved to Houston, got into politics, ran for Senate in 1964, lost, ran for Congress in 1966, won, served 2 terms. Then Nixon appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, then chairman of the Republican National Committee during Watergate, which was like being captain of the Titanic after it hit the iceberg. Then Ford made him envoy to China, then CIA director. Reagan picked him as vice president in 1980. Bush served loyally for 8 years, rarely disagreeing in public, doing the work, waiting his turn. In 1988, he ran for president. Won easily. Promised to continue Reagan's legacy while being kinder and gentler, which was either a subtle criticism or just good politics. Bush's presidency was defined by foreign policy. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. He managed the end of the Cold War without triumphalism or disaster. Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and Bush assembled a coalition of 34 nations, launched Operation Desert Storm, and liberated Kuwait in 6 weeks with minimal American casualties. He lost re-election in 1992 to Bill Clinton. The economy was struggling. He'd broken his no new taxes pledge, and Clinton was young, charismatic, and played the saxophone on late-night television. Bush went home to Texas, lived quietly, watched his sons enter politics, died in 2018 at 94, the longest-lived president at the time. And the man who beat him? He'd grown up poor and charmed his way to the top. The Rhodes Scholar who played sax, Bill Clinton, grew up in Hope, Arkansas, and then Hot Springs, a town famous for gambling, horse racing, and organized crime. His stepfather was an alcoholic who beat his mother. Clinton stood up to him once, as a teenager, and told him never to hit her again. It worked, sort of. The violence stopped, but the damage was done. Clinton learned early how to charm people, diffuse tension, and survive chaos by being the smartest person in the room. He was a Rhodes Scholar, studied at Oxford, avoided the draft during Vietnam through a combination of luck, a high draft number, and an ROTC deferral he later backed out of. It became a campaign issue in 1992. Clinton didn't deny it, just said he opposed the war and moved on. He went to Yale Law School, met Hillary Rodham, who was smarter than him and probably more ambitious. They married in 1975, moved to Arkansas. Clinton became a law professor, then ran for Congress, lost, became Attorney General of Arkansas, then governor at 32. The youngest governor in the country, he lost re-election 2 years later, came back and won again in 1984, served 5 more terms, built a national profile, and in 1992 ran for president as a New Democrat, moderate, pro-business, tough on crime, played the sax on the Arsenio Hall show wearing sunglasses, won. His presidency was chaotic. He passed a major deficit reduction bill, presided over the longest peacetime economic expansion in American history, signed NAFTA, reformed welfare, but he was also impeached for lying under oath about an affair with Monica Lewinsky, a White House intern. The Senate acquitted him, and his approval ratings stayed high because the economy was booming and people apparently didn't care. He left office popular, gave speeches, made millions, watched Hillary run for president twice, and lived to see himself remembered more for scandal than accomplishment, which probably isn't fair but also isn't entirely wrong. And the man who followed him? He was the son of a president, the governor of Texas, and a cheerleader at Yale. The cheerleader who became a wartime president, George Walker Bush, was a cheerleader at Yale. Head cheerleader, actually. 1964 to 1968. Led the crowd, wore the uniform, did the routines. It's objectively the least presidential thing you can imagine, and yet there he was, years later in the Oval Office, making decisions about war and terrorism while people struggled to reconcile the frat boy with the commander-in-chief. Before politics, Bush worked in the oil industry, co-founded an energy company called Arbusto, which is Spanish for bush, and also a terrible name for a business. It failed. Merged with another company. That failed too. Eventually, Bush got out of oil and bought a share of the Texas Rangers baseball team. That worked. He became the public face of the team, sat in the stands, knew players' names, and turned the Rangers into a profitable franchise. He ran for governor of Texas in 1994. Beat Ann Richards, a popular incumbent who underestimated him. Served 2 terms. Built a reputation as a compassionate conservative, which mostly meant he was less mean than other Republicans. Then he ran for president in 2000. The election was a disaster. Bush lost the popular vote to Al Gore by over 500,000 votes. The Electoral College came down to Florida, where Bush's brother Jeb was governor. The vote was so close it triggered a recount, then lawsuits. Then the Supreme Court stepped in and stopped the recount, handing the presidency to Bush. It was 5-4, the closest, most controversial election in modern history. Then September 11th happened. Hijackers flew planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. 3,000 people died. Bush, who'd been president for 8 months and seemed in over his head, suddenly had clarity. He declared a war on terror, invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't. The war dragged on for years. Thousands of Americans died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. Bush left office in 2009 with the economy collapsing, 2 wars ongoing, and approval ratings in the 20s. Went home to Texas, took up painting, and the man who replaced him? He'd been a community organizer in Chicago who somehow became the first black president. The community organizer who became President Barack Hussein Obama organized communities in Chicago, worked for a church-based group helping residents of the South Side fight for better housing, jobs, and schools. He was 24, fresh out of Columbia, idealistic, convinced that ordinary people could organize and create change if someone just helped them see their own power. He spent 3 years doing it, made very little money, learned how systems worked, how power flowed, how change happened slowly, if at all. Before Chicago, Obama grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia. His father was Kenyan. His mother was white from Kansas. They separated when he was 2. His father went back to Kenya. Obama barely knew him. His mother remarried an Indonesian man, moved to Jakarta, and Obama spent part of his childhood there before moving back to Hawaii to live with his grandparents. He went to Occidental College in Los Angeles, then transferred to Columbia, studied political science, moved to Chicago, organized, then went to Harvard Law School, where he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review. It made national news. Publishing houses offered him book deals. He wrote Dreams from My Father, a memoir about race, identity, and belonging. He moved back to Chicago, practiced civil rights law, taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, ran for the Illinois State Senate in 1996, won, served 7 years, then ran for U.S. Senate in 2004. Gave a keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention that made him a national star. Won the Senate race in a landslide. 4 years later, he ran for president, beat Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, then beat John McCain in the general election, became the first black president in American history. He was 47, the 3rd youngest president ever elected. He inherited 2 wars and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, passed a stimulus bill, bailed out the auto industry, signed the Affordable Care Act, expanding health insurance to millions, ordered the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, normalized relations with Cuba, negotiated the Iran nuclear deal. He left office popular. Republicans hated him, obstructed everything, refused to hold hearings for his Supreme Court nominee, but Obama stayed calm, stayed measured, and watched as the man who replaced him tore down almost everything he'd built. The real estate developer who became President Donald John Trump was a real estate developer, inherited a fortune from his father, Fred Trump, a ruthless landlord in Queens who built middle-income housing and got investigated by the Justice Department for racial discrimination. Donald took that money, moved to Manhattan, and spent decades building towers, casinos, and golf courses with his name in giant gold letters. He went bankrupt 6 times. Not personally, his businesses, casinos in Atlantic City, a failed airline, a failed football league, but he always walked away richer using bankruptcy laws to shield himself while contractors and investors ate the losses. He became a reality TV star. The Apprentice premiered in 2004. Trump played a successful businessman firing people on camera. "You're fired" became his catchphrase. The show ran for 14 seasons, made Trump a household name, convinced millions of people that he was a genius dealmaker instead of someone who'd inherited wealth and branded his way through life. He ran for president in 2016. Nobody took him seriously. He had no political experience, no filter, said things that should have ended his campaign a dozen times. but he won the Republican primary anyway, then beat Hillary Clinton despite losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million, won the Electoral College, became president. He governed by chaos, fired staff constantly, tweeted insults at journalists, celebrities, and foreign leaders, pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, banned travel from several Muslim-majority countries, separated families at the border, got impeached twice, once for pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, once for inciting the January 6th riot at the Capitol. The Senate acquitted him both times. He lost re-election to Biden in 2020, refused to concede, claimed fraud, filed lawsuits, all failed, left office, got indicted, ran again in 2024, won, became the second president to serve non-consecutive terms. And the man who beat him the first time? He'd spent nearly 50 years in politics, commuting by train, and waiting for his moment. The Amtrak commuter who waited 50 years, Joe Biden, took the train. Every day. Amtrak from Wilmington, Delaware to Washington, D.C., round trip, for 36 years as a senator. 90 minutes each way. He did it because his wife and infant daughter were killed in a car accident in 1972, just weeks after he was elected to the Senate. His 2 sons survived but were injured. Biden thought about resigning, didn't want to leave them. But he took the oath of office in the hospital where his sons were recovering, and then he went home every night. Took the train, tucked them in, came back the next morning. Before politics, Biden was a lawyer. Not a particularly successful one. Practiced in Wilmington, took whatever cases came, then got into local politics, served on the Newcastle County Council, ran for Senate in 1972 at 29. Nobody thought he could win. He did. Became one of the youngest senators in American history. He ran for president in 1988. Dropped out after getting caught plagiarizing a speech from British politician Neil Kinnock. It was humiliating. Biden went back to the Senate, became chair of the Judiciary Committee, led the hearings for Supreme Court nominees, then chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, spent decades building expertise, relationships, and a reputation as someone who could work across the aisle. He ran for president again in 2008, lost badly to Obama. Obama picked him as vice president. Biden served loyally for 8 years, then his son Beau died of brain cancer in 2015. Biden was shattered, decided not to run in 2016, watched Trump win, regretted it. He ran in 2020, was the oldest major party nominee in history at 77, beat Trump, became the oldest president ever inaugurated at 78, governed during a pandemic, passed a massive infrastructure bill, forgave student loans, withdrew from Afghanistan chaotically, watched inflation spike, faced questions about his age, his stamina, his sharpness. He ran for re-election in 2024, struggled in debates, dropped out, endorsed Kamala Harris, watched her lose to Trump. And Biden, after 50 years in politics, went home to Delaware. Back to the train station, back to where it started. And that brings us to the present. 45 presidents, 45 completely different paths to the same impossible job. Surveyors and soldiers, lawyers and lifeguards, men who failed at selling hats, teaching school, and running general stores before somehow convincing an entire nation to trust them with nuclear codes. So the next time you scroll through a list of presidents and wonder how we made it this far, just remember, someone once got elected after being a cheerleader at Yale. Another walked away from a nuclear submarine to grow peanuts, and one guy literally hanged 2 people, then governed the largest democracy on earth. Twice. History doesn't follow a script. It just stumbles forward, one ambitious disaster at a time. Sleep tight, and be grateful you're not the one who has to explain your resume to future generations.